Chapter 12, Celebrating New Friends * Burning Battleground, Arena, Hell * Rias watched as Issei shrunk back into a humanoid form. The fur rescinded deep into his body as skin once again became his prominent body covering. The severe burns that had covered his body prior to his transformation seemed to have healed for the most part. Some burns still remained on his skin, however they were no longer anywhere near as harsh, rampant or life-threatening as they had been. Despite this respite though, his skin was still split and torn from the various injuries he had suffered, spilling blood onto the ground below. Her boyfriend was approaching the ground as his naked body once again resembled his saiyan self. His feet had barely touched the ground as Rias watched him crumble under the weight of supporting himself. She shot forward, determined to catch the collapsing and exhausted boy who hard fought so very hard for her. Almost given his life for her. As her hands wrapped themselves under his armpits, she braced to support his weight. Once balanced, Rias ran a hand over his face and looked onto the unconscious features. She lowered her lips and kissed his forehead, wishing for him to heal swiftly. Despite his state, she could feel the intense heat and depth of the pure ki within him. It radiated out of Issei, and the only way Rias could describe it was that it felt right. It was powerful, protective, and filled her with contentment. It was truly a feeling of love. Her peaceful embrace was broken as Issei's body faded and vanished from her arms in the same soft pink light as all others who had been unable to continue throughout the match. For a moment Rias was taken aback before realizing that it was simply the medical system of the arena transporting him to the infirmary. A brief glance toward where Riser's body had lain confirmed that she was indeed the only one still standing within the arena. She had won her first rating game. Water began to rain down upon Rias, and she looked up to see the thick torrents pouring from the nozzles of the fire safety systems within the roof of the arena. Now that the match was over, the blazes that Riser had started would be extinguished before any excess damage could occur. Her wings unfolded from her back and Rias rose into the air, relishing the feeling of the water running down her skin and through her clothes. The water felt different than usual, it felt like freedom. Her eyes closed with a smile forming on her lips as she floated there, letting the minutes pass by. Rias knew that she had to leave the arena, but being here, just floating and basking in the relief that she felt, allowed her to be without any responsibilities or pressure. Beating wings broke the therapeutic pitter-patter of the falling water, and Rias opened her eyes, turning to the sound. Both Grafia and Surzex glided toward her with broad smiles upon their faces. They stopped short of her and simply smiled at the young heiress to House Gremory. Surzex knew he didn't have to tell his sister that she was free, but he felt as if saying it made it more real. More official. As per the agreed wager of this match, you are free to pursue your own romantic relationships. His voice was kind and full of compassion as he spoke to Rias. A broad smile of pure, simple and true happiness played across Rias' face as she flew forward into a brief hug with her brother and his wife. As she broke away from Grafia, another pair of individuals approached and Rias' face morphed further into excitement. "Mother, father, you're both here!" she exclaimed happily, flying forward to embrace her parents. "When did you both return?" "In time for our daughter's first rating game, of course," her mother replied with proud expression, and what a match it was. Many senior devils would love to claim a victory with such odds. Rias continued to beam at her mother's praise as her father spoke up. "It really was amazing, sweetheart. Your peerage has come leaps and bounds, but you must tell us everything about that last boy, the one who became the giant ape and thrashed Riser so thoroughly." Her father's voice changing from proud to teasing with a knowing glance to finish his sentence. While Issei is, Rias began feeling both awkward and uncharacteristically shy, unsure of how to explain the boy. Fortunately for her, Grafia took pity on her and jumped in, changing the conversation seamlessly and leading her parents-in-law away without an issue, leaving the Gremory heiress with her brother. Surzex just shook his head slightly with a soft snort of laughter. "I am always amazed how easily she directs mother and father," the Lord of Hell commented before continuing. "However, let us not let the crowd wait, so many people are clamoring to see you." Rias smiled in agreement and the siblings soared toward the exit with lazy beats of their wings. Rias felt as light as a feather with relief and couldn't keep the happiness from her face. Passing through the same entrance that they had arrived at to begin the match, Rias was bombarded by the excited chatter of the audience. While the arena itself had blocked out external noises, here she could hear everything that was spoken above her. Much of the crowd still remained. Discussions ranged from amazement and congratulations of her victory to whether Riser had thrown the match or been overly arrogant. Some speculated about the magic he even used to transform, but the main topic of conversation was issei. Most of the devils had never seen or even knew of the different elements that made up pure ki. For them, Shoki had been their only focus. The bending and manipulating of it into magic. They certainly didn't know of science, and so now there was voracious conversations discussing his origins, strength, power, stamina, and of course his transformation. Rias only listened for a few minutes before moving on. As she did, Rias left Surzek's side. It was clear that she was making her way directly to the infirmary that had been established. Rias approached the single-story building that had been converted into the match infirmary. Previously it had been a local council hall, but now the main hall was filled with beds, medical equipment and monitors of sorts. A lot of medical personnel were looking rather worn out and worse for wear. Most looked completely exhausted. Rias approached the reception and a young blue-haired woman looked up from her computer to greet her. "Oh, Miss Gremory. Your peerage is just through the main doors behind me." Rias smiled in thanks before moving around the receptionist and pushing through the swinging double doors. She was met by quite the sight. On the left of the room sat all the members of her peerage. Issei was closest to the door, laying in a bed and completely out cold. Next sat Akino and Kaneko, who were awake and chatting with each other on the same bed, another empty bed, and then Asia and Kiba sitting on another, cuddled together and whispering to each other in clearly an intimate conversation. On the other side of the room was another 16 occupied beds. 15 of the beds held people who looked as if they had been doused in gasoline and set alight. In the center bed lay the unconscious body of Riser. As Rias walked in, all the members of her peerage looked up toward her and greeted happily at seeing their king. Broad smiles flooded their features as they gazed at the Gremory heiress. Rias moved to the side of Akino's bed and embraced her girlfriend. "Thank you. All of you. Thank you so much. I can never repay the dedication you all showed to me." Rias' voice was soft and sincere as she spoke to her close friends. Akino ran a hand over her face and down her cheek to her jawline. "Of course. I love you, Rias." As Akino finished, she leant forward and pressed her lips against her girlfriend's in a passionate yet confined kiss. The loving pair broke apart and Kaneko nodded from behind. "You have all our love and support, Rias. I'm just not going to kiss you." The small girl's words took a cheeky tone and Rias smiled in reply, letting the girl have her playful quip. Kiba concurred that they all would follow her no matter what. She respected them and took care of them. Her peerage would always support her. "But I concur with Kaneko on the kissing front though." He finished with a laugh as Asia jabbed him with her elbow. "You had better, I am the only one who gets to kiss you," the nun commented. Rias laughed at the other couple's antics. Their relationship brought a smile to her as observed their returning to whispering and holding each other. She climbed onto Akino's bed and cuddled in with her girlfriend, who wrapped her arms around Rias' waist. The Gremory heiress breathed in the soft scent of her girlfriend's hair before focusing in on the other peerage across the room. What happened to all of Riser's peerage? Surely the fighting didn't do that to them. Genuine curiosity could be heard in her voice, as well as a bit of concern. These girls weren't her enemy really, they were as much a victim of Riser's arrogance as she had been. Well, Akino started, when Issei beat the ever-loving piss out of him, he used a spell to become a phoenix. Rias nodded as this part of the story was quite well known to he, or having been there for the events in question. The spell caused flames to erupt all over his peerage. Then from the flames a red sort of mist came out of them and spiraled from the room. They all screamed as if they were being torn asunder when it came from them though. A look of disgust spread across Rias' features. She spat with a jerk of her head toward Riser. Must have used forbidden magic to achieve his transformation then. Such a coward. Aquino agreed and whilst not saying anything squeezed Rias tighter to show her how much she loved and would protect her girlfriend. Grammary Mansion, Hell Sunday afternoon found Issei tugging uncomfortably at the collar of a suit that Rias and Aquino had both picked out for him. It was a very well-tailored three-piece black suit, but despite the quality it still restricted him far more than he was fond of. Especially around the tail region. The young scion had found that as time moved on he was becoming more and more inclined toward loose-fitting. Fact, the thought of designing his own fighting GI had crossed his mind more than once. Issei tugged at the collar once more before glancing at the dress watch that both his girlfriends had chosen for him to wear. It read 3:15. Still half an hour until Aquino was going to collect him. Since visiting the peerage in the infirmary, Rias had been busy with a tedious amount of house grammary duties and Issei hadn't seen hide nor tail of her. He had woken up this morning feeling sore but none the worse for wear after the treatment he had received. Kiba and Kaneko had informed him that even though Rias was now free of her betrothal to Riser, she was still required to attend quite a few formal duties. Especially as her raiding game caused quite a stir in the underworld. It was for this reason that a formal dinner and ball was being held tonight in celebration of their victory, but also to allow Rias and Surzex a chance to address the upper echelons of Devil Society in one swoop. A task that Issei in no way envied. Issei felt rather uncomfortable about the idea of the dinner and ball himself. He was quite aware that large portions of the devil population weren't exactly his biggest fans and that his formal etiquette was something that was quite frankly lacking. He pushed these less than productive thoughts aside and sat cross-legged on the floor with his eyes closed. If he was to have to wait, then he would put the time to use. He began to float into the air as his ki rose and a faint white aura erupted around him. With his arms outstretched in front of him, he searched deep into his core and then began to channel his energy reserves whilst concentrating. A purple ball of perfectly formed ki very similar to his Gallic gun pulsed into life and then retracted. Issei repeated this process each time, trying to push more energy into the silent attack. Without the phonetic incantation, the energy output was far less. However, Issei believed he could with time train himself to launch the attack at full strength silently. Furthermore, he was determined to increase the power and reduce the energy drain of the deadly technique on himself. Overall, it would be quite the overhaul, but it was one that he would dedicate himself to achieving. Issei heard the faint click of the bedroom door opening. This prompted him to push his auditory and ki senses out around himself. Like an old radio set, he fine-tuned himself to try and identify who had entered. He already suspected that it was Aquino, but recently Issei had begun to notice that every person had a slight different ki signature, and if he pushed a small haze of ki out from around himself, then he would be able to identify who that person was. He had kept this suspicion to himself as he simply wanted to confirm it before speaking with anyone about it, even Drake. If he was correct, then it would be the third technique that he would develop on his own after his basic blue-white blast and flight. Issei's senses created an almost sonar-style image of the person before him. A faint pulsing outline that glowed bright for a brief moment before fading. Even with his eyes closed, he could see Aquino creeping toward him. She believed that he was yet to notice her, and a devious thought entered Issei's mind. While still creating and withdrawing the Gallic gun, he began to rotate in the air until he was upside down. Aquino was less than a meter from him, obviously watching what he was doing. Once completely upside down, he retracted the energy in his hands one last time and shot forward toward her. Before she could react, his lips had embraced hers and his arms had lifted her by the waist. Issei smirked into the kiss as he felt the shock run through her body at what he had just done. Her body was briefly tense from the startle before she relaxed into his kiss and embrace. Issei placed her back down, broke the kiss and let himself flip backwards onto his feet once more. His eyes opening as his feet met the floor once more. "Did you hear me enter?" Aquino asked with a pout and sooky puppy dog eyes. "Yep." Issei replied, choosing not to elaborate. "I guess it's time to go try being all formal and stuff, right?" he continued in a slightly deflated voice. He was more than excited to support and be there for Rias, but less than excited to have to be formal. Aquino just giggled whilst leading Issei out of the room hand in hand. The great hall of House Grammary was neatly decorated and heavily packed. Noble families from all across Hell had traveled to the celebration of Rias Gremory's first victory. While some had come out of sheer pleasure for her success, others had been intrigued by the wager of the match. Many suspected that there would be some political fallout from the outcome, and still more had come to witness the scion who had defeated the previously undefeatable Riser Phoenix. Each table seated 24 guests. They were decorated in expensive fabrics of rich reds and midnight black. The rose symbol of House Gremory prominently on display across all the table settings. At the head table sat Surzex with Graphia beside him on a pair of heavily ornate chairs. To the right of them sat another pair of devils, a man with red hair and a woman who was a brunette. This couple appeared older than Surzex, but by how much Issei couldn't tell. Intuition told him that they were probably the parents of Rias and Surzex that he had thus far not met. He knew they had returned in time to see the match, but asking Aquino about them had only resulted in sly grins from his girlfriend. To the other side sat a Juka and a woman with long black hair tied in twin ponytails while wearing a frilly dress that looked more suited to a child. Try as he might, Issei didn't recognize her at all. Sweeping his vision around the room, Issei found that the peerage was sat at a table close to the front and in line with Surzex. 3 chairs sat empty with one at the head and the 2 either side. As Issei and Aquino crossed the room to join their friends and many other heads turned to follow them, gossip and whispers sprung like wildfire in the air. This only led to Issei feeling more awkward and out of place than he previously had as a blush covered his cheeks. He moved quietly to sit beside Kaneko and was very glad when she pulled the seat out for him to quickly slide into. Aquino sat opposite him beside Asia, leaving the head chair available for Rias. "You're looking far better than I last saw you," Kaneko commented as Issei took his seat. The scion himself simply smirked in reply. "Definitely better than Riser, I'd wager." The group snickered at Issei's remark and broke into light conversation. Issei remained quiet for the most part, content to listen to the conversations of his friends. As each of the group had operated independently for the most part of the raiding game, they were all telling stories of their fights. Kaneko and Kiba began to try to outdo each other with the descriptions of their ambushes. However, both sat silently stunned when Aquino proudly relayed how Asia had sent back Ubaluna's own spells, resulting in Ravel's defeat. As neither had expected Asia to be effective on the offensive, this news came as quite the shock. Kiba threw his arm over her should and pulled it tight around his girlfriend in pride, while Kaneko cheered that Asia had defeated the girl who had bested her. Issei continued to feel uncomfortable as he sat with his friends. He could feel the constant glances and stares of the devils around the room, as well as hear their hushed conversations. As most had never seen or heard of a scion before, they were unaware of just how sensitive and effective his hearing was. For the most part, the comments were benign in nature. Quite a few devil ladies had commented on his handsome appearance and strong body, which caused his blushing to deepen, while many had speculated about his ape-like tail making him a form of Yuki. Still other comments were of a derogatory nature that he did his absolute best to tune out and not let rile up his pride. Issei felt relief when the attention of the room was drawn to the entranceway as Rias entered the ornate hall. She wore a flowing lilac gown and walked with purpose, grace, and an air of refined confidence as she crossed the room to take her seat at the head of her peerage's table. As she took her seat, Surzex stood up. Without pause or issue, the room fell silent, everyone expectantly waiting for the choice words of one of their rulers. Issei smiled to Rias and she returned his smile before looking over to her brother. "It has been far too long since I last stood before so many of you. Far too long indeed. And while I wish to speak of the celebration this is, I have words that must be spoken to you all." Of the tone Surzex took was formal and almost alien to how Issei had become accustomed to the man speaking. It was clear that whatever Surzex said would be important. "Our world, our people have suffered. Devils, be they pure blood or low-born, are in short supply, our industry has diminished, and with such low birth rates our world sits on the precipice of collapse. But we are far from defeated. Far from drawing our last breath. We have numerous enemies, but we also have strength. We have a new generation that has proven to be diligent, resourceful, and bold. We have allies, both old and new." As he spoke of allies, his gaze drifted over to Issei. "But with new power, strength, and resources, we must not become complacent.
We shall be emboldened, daring and forward-thinking. Not rash, foolish or hasty. By our very nature as devils we are manipulative and possessive. This is unashamedly who we are, but not what will define us. To the horizons will be our greatest threat, our greatest challenge and I do believe our greatest triumph. To face these challenges we must all come together, a task that I understand is easier said than done. Old insults and rivalries run deep between the remaining families of the pillars. Old wounds that if allowed to fester will only weaken and hasten the collapse of our great people. To that I would like to speak directly to Lord and Lady Phoenix. Issei turned in his chair to watch as two devils rose to their feet. Like Riser, they had blonde hair and wore expensive clothing, however he noted that both seemed to exude an almost humble aura about them. They had an air of refined class and held themselves with purposeful dignity. Surzex cleared his throat slightly before continuing. Lord Irai and Lady Cody. I understand that you may feel cheated by the actions of yesterday's match. However, as my sister was never given a chance to choose her fate, I could not in good conscience not allow her this opportunity. I do hope that I will continue to have your support and that of your kin for the foreseeable future. With Surzek's speech complete, the room waited for whether Lord or Lady Phoenix would reply. Issei saw the slight movement of Lady Cody sliding her hand into that of her husband and smiling softly to the man whom she had married and loved. Lord Phoenix returned his wife's smile just slightly before addressing Surzex with a kind yet political voice. I would be lying if I said the actions of the match did not disappoint me. Issei let his vision drift over to Surzex to see if any change would occur on the Lucifer's face, however Surzex kept a friendly smile while waiting for the older man to continue. However, that disappoint was not for the reasons that many here may think. As a father, I was disappointed to see my son lose. My love for him only wants him to succeed, but it is that same love for him that is also glad he lost. At that remark, Issei turned back to the man speaking. The man's face was honest and showed no hint of a lie. My son has become arrogant and far too overconfident. I am hoping this loss will teach him humility, patience, and put a stop to his rampant decadence. For that, my Satan and Lady Rias, I thank you both. With his words complete, the Lord of Clan Phoenix bowed to both Surzex and Rias, with his wife doing the same. Rias and Surzex returned the gesture, and with that, the formalities concluded. Plates stacked high with food appeared on the tables. Roasts, stews, soups, pastries, pizzas, salads, fancy food and hearty food. If you could want it, it was there. Surzex invited everyone to begin, and immediately on cue the party had finally begun. Pleasant music filled the air as those in the room ate and conversed. Issei held himself back as much as he could, however his raging appetite screamed at him to eat more and more. Plates began to pile up around the ever-hungry scion, however he ate at a pace that for him was quite excruciatingly slow. Rias and Aquino shared a hushed giggle at the attempted manners being displayed by their boyfriend. As the remaining food vanished from the table by magic along with the dirty plates and cutlery, the crowds took to their feet while the central tables vanished and the outer ones became translucent before shimmering. Their space being replaced by comfortable leather and suede seating. The music picked up pace with the beat deepening. Rias and Aquino took Issei's hands, dragging the boy to the now cleared dance floor. Many other devil couples had already found their way into the clearing. The trio began to dance and both girls were pleasantly surprised to find that Issei was not the least bit unskilled at dancing. He moved fluidly with them through both upbeat fast-paced club-style songs and gracefully through slower romantic songs. As the night wore on, the music changed more often from energetic to slow and romantic. Issei swayed with a hand around both girls' hips as they nuzzled their heads into his chest. Many devil couples gave the trio odd expressions that Issei assumed to be attempts at disguised curiosity or judgment. The idea that devils who readily identified as possessive could judge them for their open relationship was something he found comically humorous and outright hypocritical. If the gaze of those surrounding them annoyed either Aquino or Rias, neither girl showed any sign of it. The only expression that did faze Issei was that of Surzex. Whilst their parents looked on at the three lovers with a calm smile, the older Gremry sibling gave Issei a look that spoke all too clearly of the consequences that he would dish out should Rias become unhappy or hurt.
While Issei felt the instinctive twinge that all men feel under the gaze of a girl's older brother, he was also glad that it proved once again how much Surzex did care for his sister. With the night drawing in to an end, Issei made ready to approach Ria's parents and introduce himself properly. Thus far he had been unable to find the opportunity to do so, and as both girls were taking a restroom break the time seemed perfect. He approached the older Gremory couple still seated at the head table. Issei's eyes locked with that of his girlfriend's father as he directed himself to the table. Upon arriving he held out his hand toward her father as he greeted the senior pair. "Hello sir, ma'am. I would like to take this opportunity to properly introduce myself." The formal words sounded rather odd coming from the usually laid-back scion, and he would be lying if he said he wasn't quite nervous. Ria's mother barely contained a giggle as Ria's father stood and took Issei's hand in his own. Issei expected a firm shake and was caught quite off guard when he was promptly pulled into a hug. Issei was temporarily unable to respond as the older man embraced him. "Good to finally meet you, Issei. My son and daughter speak so highly of you. No need for formalities. Please call me Zeoticus." Zeoticus Gremory said rather excitedly while Issei was still rather unable to form working sentences. "Oh, release the poor boy Zeo." His wife began with good-hearted chuckles as she too stood up. "Can't you see that you've scared him completely speechless?" Zeoticus released Issei, who promptly and silently thanked the women for her intervention, and turned to his wife. "How could he be scared? We just watched him face Riser Phoenix, the so-called immortal Phoenix, and win, but not just win against the man but the mythical beast as well. I say Issei doesn't feel fear." Zeoticus spoke like a man defending a heroic anime character from his favorite show. It was an experience that Issei had no reference to draw upon and found himself dumbfounded by once again. "Oh hush you," Lady Gremory sighed at her husband before turning to Issei with her hand held out in a dainty handshake. "It is lovely to meet you, Issei. My name is Venelana. Please forgive Zeoticus, he is despite everything a child at heart." Her words were not cruel or rude, simply truthful as she spoke to Issei. Now that he had essentially rebooted, Issei was able to take in the figures of Ria's parents properly. Her father, Zeoticus, was slightly taller than Surzex and roughly the same height as Issei. His body was well-toned, showing that he kept up his training, his eyes and hair the same blue and red as his children. His chin was hidden behind a well-groomed red goatee beard while his long hair was tied back in a rough ponytail. Ria's mother, Venelana, almost caused Issei to double-take as her face was so close to being a clear spitting image of Ria's, however, with a soft brown to her hair and violet eyes. Issei took her outstretched hand and shook it politely as he replied. "It is a pleasure to meet you both. I have been looking forward to meeting you both for quite a while." For the next 20 minutes Issei stumbled through the conversation with Ria's parents. Her father's laid-back and overly friendly attitude consistently undermined Issei's expectations and confidence, while her mother kept everything progressing in what she would call the right way. The couple began to question and pry Issei's life story from him, which was an experience he found rather overwhelming. Eventually he spotted Rias and Akina watching him while giggling to each other. This seemed to be the perfect chance to escape the awkward conversation, and Issei seized the chance between questions. "If you will both excuse me. It was lovely meeting you both, but I must return to my dates," Issei said to both older parents, who simply smiled and wished him well. Issei turned toward and walked over to his two girlfriends with a clear expression of relief. As he reached the pair, it became evident that both were struggling to contain their laughter at the obvious awkwardness that their boyfriend had experienced. Issei rolled his eyes as he spoke to both of them in a tone that dripped sarcasm. "I am so glad that was amusing for you both." Ria stifled a further bout of giggles as she replied to Issei, while Akina was simply content to enjoy his embarrassment. "Well, we didn't want to interrupt. It looked like you were getting to know my parents so well," Rias replied with a cheeky smile. Issei simply huffed and moved toward a table with drinks available. Both girls moved to hold either side of him as he walked over. Despite his attempts at being grumpy with them, the two vixens' presence either side of him soon had Issei smiling, and his arms found their way around both girls. After enjoying some quick refreshments and a final dance to a nice slow song on the emptying dance floor, the happy three made their way up the steps and out of the main hall. Rooms had been arranged for all the members of Rias' peerage for the night, as none intended on returning home until after school the next day. As they left the hall and made their way toward the stairway leading to the upper levels, a male voice broke the silence as it spoke to them. "Excuse me, Lady Rias, Mr. Issei, and Miss Aquino." Upon turning around, all three were shocked to learn that it was Riser's parents, Lord Irai and Lady Cody. None knew what to say. However, Riser's father continued, "I would like to take a moment of all your time to apologize for my son's behavior and to ask that you please forgive him for his attitude." The man's words were humble while his voice held nothing but sincerity. Issei was unsure how to respond. Riser had treated Rias so absolutely atrociously that he could hardly stand the man and would happily beat him senseless again. However, his parents were the polar opposite. They had done nothing to warrant a rude or aggressive response from Issei. Issei chose to just look to Rias and let her decide. After all, it was Rias whom Riser had directed his actions against. Aquino took the same line of thought that Issei had and waited for Rias' reply. The Gremory heiress simply took a deep breath before smiling to the parents of the man who had treated her as less of a person and simply an item to be collected. "I thank you for your kind words, my lord and lady. I do not wish to live my life holding on to grudges or hate, and therefore I will forgive his actions in due time. However, would prefer to not see him soon." Rias spoke with a kind voice and tried to keep any ill feelings from her words. "Thank you. I understand your desires completely. Thank you for your time." The words were simple but honest as Lord Irai and Lady Cody smiled to the dating three and took their leave. Upon arriving at Rias' room, the three all stripped off into their pajamas and climbed into her king-size bed. Despite the fun and tension that had been built up while dancing, the emotional drain that had been placed on the trio over the last 2 days sapped their ability to consider any amorous activities. Instead, both Issei and Aquino curled up on either side of Rias, letting the Gremory heiress know in a clear, definitive manner that the pair loved her and would keep her safe forever. Each enjoyed a sensual kiss before drifting off to sleep. Dusty Plateau. Issei's mindscape. Issei stood crouched atop a flat rocky outcrop overlooking a sea of clouds. His aura flared around him as he pushed his ki to its absolute limits once again. Since the ratings game, his power felt even more refined and monumental than it had previously. Like his fight against the giant phoenix had allowed him to strengthen even further. With his ki at its zenith, he took a deep breath before screaming Kaioken. Immediately he could feel the rush of the crimson aura flooding his body with power once again. Instantly his muscles bulged before settling back down. At once the energy and power that Issei usually held was dwarfed by what he was now capable of. From his vantage point circling above, Drake watched as his partner went through this transformational technique again. With the initial crimson flare subsiding, Drake focused on his own power and conjured a dozen rock golems around Issei. With the young scion's increased capability, these golems were far more powerful than those he had trained against previously. The golems instantly encircled Issei and paced around him like a pack of hungry predators. The warrior himself simply settled down into his defensive posture and calmly exhaled a slow breath. The Kaioken gave him amazing power, however it also came at the detriment of a colossal drain to his stamina. With increased practice and exposure of the rare technique's use, Issei had already come leaps and bounds in withstanding the drawbacks of each multiplier of the technique that he inflicted upon himself, especially minimizing the drain it dealt to him. But still, that didn't mean he could be flippant or arrogant in battle. He closed his eyes and pushed his senses out. Immediately, as if in a form of sonar, he could see the outlined shapes of the rock beasts around him. Where with his natural sight he would be limited to what was visible through the visor of his weighted helmet, utilizing his new ki sense as he had come to refer to it, he was able to see every living thing for all directions in vast kilometers around him. This wasn't limited to just a flat plain though, the technique covered the air above him and, although quite not as far, also through the ground beneath him. In the real physical world he could sense small insects moving around and all manner of life in the earth beneath his feet. However, the ability didn't give him any sight into where obstacles, be they natural or man-made, were unless they happened to be a living organism like a tree, shrub or other plant. The only other drawback was that Issei found he had to actively block out a lot of the smaller lifeforms so that his new sense wasn't overloaded with information.
Up on this heightened flat plateau though, those drawbacks had no bearing on Issei's ability to fight. Movement registered in Issei's mind and he watched as a pair of golems lumbered toward him from behind.
The creatures moved at a blistering pace that would put most motor vehicles to shame, but for Issei's keen senses, their speed was negligible. Continuously being honed through combat with progressively more powerful opponents and now amplified exponentially through the Kaioken, to Issei it appeared as if the creatures were struggling to wade through a thick marsh or swamp. A heavy stone fist passed by Issei's head as he shifted slightly to the right with his eyes still closed. Using the momentum of his dodge, Issei dropped backwards into a handstand while slamming his left knee into the construct's head. The golem's body was powerful and made extra durable by drag, however Issei could only ever be considered a powerhouse in his own right and now enhanced further. His knee shattered the packed earth and stone as it struck. While the body of the initial golem collapsed to the floor lifeless, Issei sunk slightly on his arms as if going to conduct a handstand push-up before straightening his arms out and propelling himself upward. He twisted his body to avoid the attacking limbs of the second golem while moving upward. With his opponent exposed from his unsuccessful attacks, Issei rolled his body mid-air and delivered a roundhouse kick that cut through the earth like a warm knife through butter. Issei landed on his feet without a drop of sweat having broken from his skin at the exact moment that the two halves of the second corpse crashed down to either side of him. As if a silent order had been given, the remaining 10 golems rushed the calm warrior. Limbs flew at him from all angles and yet none struck true as Issei dodged, weaved, and after-imaged his way through his attackers. To a human opponent or even most devils it would have seemed as if the golems were attacking flawlessly with incredible speed. To this saiyan, however, their attacks were sloppy, overly mechanical, and telegraphed. Issei conserved his power and watched his opponents as he maneuvered, only attacking when an opening presented itself. However, each attack he did deliver struck true and shattered or sliced through his opponent on contact. Within a few short minutes, Issei stood alone on the plateau once again with the rubble of his training partners around him. Above, Drake watched with pride at Issei's victory. However, this was only the first round, and with each success Issei had, the dragon would further enhance the golems, adapting the constructs to be faster, stronger, more durable, and increasingly talented. Without giving the young warrior any rest, another dozen stone warriors grew up from the ground around him. At an unseen command from the Red Dragon Emperor, these new foes, augmented by the mistakes and lessons learned by their predecessors, attacked the calm saiyan. The second round had just begun. Many hours later, Issei's flawless composure was gone. His body was coated in bloody wounds and a thick layer of sweat as he struggled to maintain his Kaioken. Only one opponent faced him. The golem was of the 15th round. This opponent, though, was far more powerful than his predecessors. His strong hide was like an armor that Issei could not breach despite pushing his body and Kaioken to a third times amplification. In contrast to him, the golem's strength allowed him to tear through Issei's red plate armor with ease and deliver devastating blows to the saiyan. His speed and talent in combat also met Issei's without question. Drake had stuck to his word in creating a true challenge for the young eager warrior. Dust whipped up around the duo as they threw themselves at each other once more. Plate metal met granite and shattered, making way for hardened flesh to take its place as their strikes collided into the others. Back and forth the two warriors fought with neither gaining nor submitting any ground to the other. Issei's stamina was close to depleted, and using his Kaioken in its third multiplier was draining him at a tremendous rate. Flashes of power broke the air as the pair fought at speeds beyond that of simple matter. To put it simply, they were moving beyond light speed. Issei twisted to avoid an overhead hammer fist but was not completely successful. The blow struck his left shoulder and tore the thick pauldron from what remained of the damaged plate armor to have survived so far. As the plate ripped away, it slowed the golem's momentum, just briefly allowing Issei the opportunity to drive his right elbow into his opponent's exposed armpit. Issei moved to follow his strike with a series of jabs into the exposed side of the construct. Cracks and splinters appeared in the side of the golem as Issei focused his attacks on the same inch. However, in his drive to break through his opponent, Issei's vision became progressively more tunneled. A strong grip took a hold of his neckline and pushed down as a fist buried itself into his stomach.
Issei coughed and spluttered as blood, spit and bile shot from his mouth with more exploding out from his nose. Pain flared through his abdomen that caused his crimson aura to falter white momentarily as the Kaioken temporarily broke. Despite that Issei's resolve wouldn't crack, he raised his knees to his chest and struck simultaneously with both feet as his Kaioken kicked back in from its temporary stutter. The power of the kangaroo kick propelled the large golem backwards through the air as Issei tumbled down to his feet. Issei panted hard as he corrected his footing and lowered himself back down into his stance. The golem propelled itself back onto its feet and prepared to assault Issei yet again. The saiyan knew his stamina wouldn't hold much longer and that once it broke he would lose his Kaioken. With the Kaioken lost he wouldn't be able to continue to fight against this golem. The golem rushed forward toward Issei in a posture that provided no opening for him to exploit at his current capability. With the creature meters away, Issei tore and delved into the remainder of his ki pool. Multiply 5, he screamed as the last residual drops of his ki fired through his body in one motion. With a tremendous increase that rushed through him, the golem's speed suddenly slowed as Issei's reactions and instincts grew exponentially. Instantly openings became clear in his enemy's movements and Issei shot forward striking and parrying against the golem. A swift straight broke into the creature's shoulder while a series of uppercuts shattered its pelvis. Before Issei could finish it though, a double overhead strike crashed down on his back, driving him into the ground. Weight pushed and crushed down on him as the damaged being drove its body down onto him. Issei felt his ki break and the Kaioken flood out of his body, leaving him weakened, drained and vulnerable. The ground shook as Drake landed beside the pair. Issei felt the weight of the dying being ripped from him as the dragon dismissed it from existence. Even without the weight of the golem bearing down on him, Issei couldn't move. The remnants of his armor was now too heavy to lift and crushed his flesh and lungs as he continued to breathe. Drake dismissed the armor and Issei gulped in a large lungful of air as he lay naked on his back. Bloody swathes and tears broke through his bruised and beaten skin. You pushed yourself too far. All your ki is gone and you are as defenseless as a newborn baby. In fact, you are very lucky to not be dead. Drake's voice sounded neutral as if he were simply stating facts in a lecture, but Issei could hear the soft background tones of concern in the great dragon's words. Issei chuckled softly, there was nothing else he could do. State Middle School, Tokyo. Thursday afternoon found Issei conducting his first hunt since before training for the raiding game, which was a boon to him as the school lessons of the new term had been particularly dull. Akino chose to join him as she would have been home alone otherwise. Rias was attending a function with Sona Citri alongside Kaneko while Kiba and Asia went on a date together. Rias had attended the Citri residence on official business while Kaneko slipped along under the guise of simple curiosity, yet everyone knew she simply hoped to catch a glimpse of a certain pawn of Sona. So far the school week had passed uneventfully for Issei. The lessons didn't stimulate him anywhere near as effectively as training and combat did, resulting in him zoning out. He still learned the subject matter but found himself paying less attention than he previously would have. He wasn't at risk of failing any of his classes. It just simply meant that his saiyan drive was taking hold of him more and more. Every day he became more aligned to the attitudes of what those in the past would have called a pure-blood saiyan, regardless of having never actually met one. Issei and Akino floated along the first-floor corridors in between rows of lockers. Akino's wings allowed her to float silently with subtle beats while only the slightest white aura encased Issei as he kept pace beside her easily. Lightning arced between Akino's fingers as she was on guard, however Issei simply floated seemingly at ease. It was something that would have annoyed Akino if she didn't know that his combat instincts were constantly alert and well trained enough for him to seem dismissive while being completely alert. Issei didn't expect tonight's hunt to be too difficult or dangerous. Sona had given the pair of them quite a bit of information before they had left. With Tokyo being her area of responsibility, it had been decent of Sona to assist them while they assisted her by completing the hunt. Despite that though, Issei was rather impressed with how much knowledge she had been able to divulge prior to them moving to eliminate the rogue. Usually he just received a brief description and a location. The pair met no one throughout the first floor. They didn't expect to, as they had been told the devil's lair, so to speak, was on the second floor,
in vicinity of the science department. The powerful couple floated up the first stairwell they encountered to reach the second floor. The science department's main double doors lay ahead of them, firmly closed. Issei drifted forward with Akino behind him as they approached the doors. A quick twist of the handles let them know that they were locked. The pair looked to each other, with Issei simply shrugging before putting his weight against the door. With the minimum of effort, he broke his way through, taking both doors off their hinges. Before either could crash to the ground and alert anyone present, Issei caught the doors and lowered them in a controlled manner to the floor in much the same delicate way that he would remove his armor in his mindscape. Akino simply rolled her eyes at the destructive nature of her boyfriend. That boy was always breaking things. The science department was pitch black as the pair entered. Akino took the lead with her devil sight, allowing her to see far better than Issei in the thick darkness. Even with her superior sight though, Akino could only see for a few feet around her. Magic permeated in the air, making vision more difficult than usual. Akino turned to Issei and spoke without letting worry fill her soft voice. "There's magic in the air. I can barely see." "It's okay. Our target is about 40 meters in on our right," Issei replied in a confident, quiet whisper. "How do you know that?" Akino asked with curiosity filling her voice. Was Issei doing something similar to how he knew where she was before the ball? Issei went to reply when a high-pitched voice broke the air. "Oh he. Some more silly people want to play in my shadows with me?" The voice sounded like that of a small child. Turning to where Issei had indicated their opponent should be, the pair saw a small girl. She was possibly 10 or 11 years of age, wearing a green school blazer with a white uniform underneath. Black devil wings flared from her back. The girl's brown hair fell down to her waist in a single braid. Her delicate facial features were twisted in a sadistic gaze as she stared upon the pair from out of the darkness. "I'm going to enjoy playing with you both. You will be my toys." "But my toys always break." The girl had a haughty voice that pouted in her last sentence. However, neither Akino nor Issei could take her seriously. Clearly the young rogue had preyed on humans in the past and become very comfortable with her powers. That comfort had driven her to feel superior and unbeatable. Issei couldn't help but find the situation humorous. A perk of his key sense was that he could feel the depth to the key of those he sensed. If he concentrated hard enough, he could even break down the levels of their ki to analyze their potency of Shoki, Yuki and Genki. He had smirked to himself when he found that his and Surzek's total ki reserves had been very similar in potency as well as Ajuka's. Graphia's ki had startled Issei by being larger than any he had felt so far, including his own. Draeg's energy was something Issei couldn't feel, and he had been meaning to speak to the powerful dragon about it. Feeling this young devil's energy, it was clear that she had only just under a third of the energy that Akino had and was nowhere near Issei. Issei turned to Akino in an offhand manner. "Do you want to deal with her, or shall I?" Issei deliberately let boredom fill his voice, knowing it would offend and anger their enemy. Instantly the girl took the bait. "Silly toy. I will be playing with you both," she declared with indignation. The devil flared her wings, floated up slightly, then swooped at the duo. The darkness permeated from her body. As she got close, she raised her hands up toward the duo, revealing crimson claws. The girl swept toward Issei, clearly angered by his remark, yet as she struck, her claws went through the now transparent image that he left behind. The girl's face contorted into a look of shock after passing through the afterimage. Issei's voice sounded out from behind her. "Definitely all yours, Akino," he stated loudly in the same bored tone. The young devil whipped around to see Issei leaning lazily against a wall 50 meters away as Akino approached her. Akino held her hands out in front of her while lightning sparked between her fingers. With a flick of her wrist, lightning arced from her hands and struck the smaller devil, sending her tumbling into the wall behind her. The devil picked herself up with pain flooding through her body. As she raised herself back up, she shot darkness from her body toward Akino. A bright flash broke through the darkness while scorching into her vision, causing her to be momentarily rendered blind. She raised her arms up to protect her sight instinctively. The burning in her eyes vanished and she dropped her arms to find Akino standing before her with a hand held out. A great orb of lightning formed in her palm. Fear shot through the girl and tears poured from her eyes. She knew that she was about to be killed. Slain for her actions in killing others and being unable to fulfill her role to her master. Akino watched as the devil's head dropped and tears fell from her eyes, rolled down her face and splashed at her feet. She sniffled as her shoulders collapsed and Akino watched the devil resign herself to her death. The lightning orb grew and crackled in her hands. As she was about to fire it off, words left the devil's mouth. "I don't want to die." The words were soft, broken, weak and scared. Akino heard the words and held the lightning in her hand. Rogue devils were mindless. With the powers taking over their mind and causing them to become animalistic, barbaric and inhuman. The things they didn't do was show remorse, fear or resignation. Those were sentient feelings that rogue devils couldn't feel. Akino paused, the lightning remaining present in her hand. Issei saw her hesitation and moved beside his girlfriend. The rogue devil's body shook softly with fear as the pair looked upon her. "Why are you hesitating?" Issei asked bluntly. "She is unwell. That is to say, her emotions aren't completely gone. She still has some of her mind." Akino stumbled out. Issei thought on what she said before stepping forward toward the girl. He knew he had no reason to be wary around this devil, although while appearing completely at ease, he still kept his defensive instincts up. "What's your name?" he asked the sobbing girl. The girl quivered before looking up at the taller teens before her. She was smart enough to know that she couldn't possibly beat them. The girl had beaten her so easily while the boy seemed completely disinterested in fighting her, almost as if her power was something he had no reason to fear. She felt anger at his dismissal, anger at her defeat and finally pain mixed with fear at her potential demise. She wanted nothing more than to face these two and unleash her magic against them, yet she couldn't. Fear held her and so she mumbled her response, still facing the floor. "Sarah. Sarah Tanaka. And what happened to your master?" Akino asked this question from behind Issei. The girl took her time replying. When she did, she raised her eyes up to look at the pair before her. "He left me here and said he didn't need me anymore." Akino understood immediately. This girl hadn't strayed and defied her master. He had abandoned her, and once abandoned she was unable to control or contain her own abilities. Slowly she had been devolving into a mindless beast that only understood her base desires. "How long ago did this happen?" Akino asked while allowing empathy into her voice. Perhaps it was the caring nature of House Gremory or the situation with her own parents, either way she couldn't help but feel pity for this girl. "You weren't a devil for long before he left you here, were you?" Issei stated rather than asked. The girl simply nodded and Issei looked to Akino. His girlfriend's face was neutral, as if she couldn't work out how she wanted to handle this situation. On the one hand, the girl was a rogue devil who had attacked and presumably killed humans to fulfill her base instincts. On the other hand, she was a child who had no control over her situation at all. Akino thought for a moment before kneeling down level with the girl. She knew the next action she took would be a risk. Akino took a breath and then addressed the girl once again. "Look. I am going to make you one offer. She indicated to herself and Issei before continuing, have been instructed to deal with you. So the way I see it, this can go in one of two ways. Either we kill you or you can come with us to meet my peerage king. She might be able to help you control yourself and become who you really are, who you were meant to be." Akino's voice was as empathetic as possible despite the situation. Issei had a solid suspicion that she would make an offer like that to Devil. Akino had strong parental and protective instincts despite how much she tried to hide it. The girl looked at the pair with an expression that neither could read. She stood staring at them or through them, it was impossible to tell. After a few minutes she spoke again. "Why?" Her voice soft. Akino went to speak, yet Issei placed his hand on her shoulder.
She looked at him and he smiled before speaking. Look. I get it. You probably don't think well of Devil Masters, but Rias Gremory is a compassionate woman that would never do any harm to her peerage. He also tried to keep his voice friendly, but it wasn't quite as easy for him. After all, a quarter of an hour ago this girl was planning to kill them. With his part said, Issei stepped behind Aquino and waited for the girl to reply. The girl took a moment before dropping her sight from the pair and nodding. Citri residence, Hal Rias had spent the entire afternoon and early evening discussing politics, or more to the point she sat at the table but listened as the four Satans discussed issues along with the heads of the most prominent great families. Zeoticus and Venelana had attended with Rias invited so that she could gain experience on such matters. Topics discussed ranged from economics and low-class devil housing through to the current rankings in the rating games. Rias studiously listened to everything whilst observing the ways in which the family heads traded points against each other and bartered favors around over topics they deemed important to their families. The various meetings lasted for hours with minimal events before finally coming to an end. Leaving the large sterile meeting room for the last time, Rias grabbed her bag, automatically checking her phone. She had a set of messages, but the second from Aquino caught her attention. The first message simply confirmed her and Issei arriving at the school in Tokyo, while the second was something she didn't expect. This girl isn't completely lost. We might be able to bring her back. Her master abandoned her. Rias read the message twice before conjuring up the Gremory symbol and vanishing from the residence. She reappeared instantaneous inside a hallway. Stairs leading to a level below sat to her right, while an opening that used to contain double doors sat to her left. The doors themselves were placed to the side neatly. Rows of lockers filled the hallway in both directions. Turning toward the open doorway, Rias was greeted by the sight of the two people she loved and a small girl she had never met. Issei stood leaning lazily against a wall opposite the opening while Aquino and the young girl sat next to each other on the floor chatting. At her appearance, the conversation ended with the young girl becoming awkwardly silent. Rias looked to Issei and he smiled at her as he walked over to her side. The pair shared a quick kiss before he stepped behind the doorframe so that he was out of the small girl's eyesight as he spoke to Rias in a soft tone. She has been pretty compliant since she lost to Aquino. Had some kind of issue with her previous master and he abandoned her here. She doesn't have a very good grasp of her powers and was only a devil for a brief time before being discarded. Rias nodded while maintaining her gaze on the girl who was looking at her with a blank expression. Rias approached the sitting girls and Aquino stood and embraced her. The pair sharing a kiss before Rias turned and addressed the young girl who now stood awkwardly against the wall. My name is Rias Gremory. My queen Aquino, she said while indicating to her girlfriend, has completely defeated you. By rights as a rogue devil you should be executed, however Aquino has informed me that you did not choose your current situation. Also that you have not fully succumbed to your base state yet. As such I have agreed to attempt to help you if you will agree to submitting to me and becoming a member of my peerage. Rias' voice was authoritative yet kind as she spoke to the small devil. The girl looked at Rias with her sight once again looking at and or through her as she did. So die or join you? Her voice flat as she spoke. Before Rias could interject the girl continued. I don't want to die. I guess I have no choice. Her voice sounded broken and like she couldn't trust again. Aquino placed a hand on the small girl's shoulder, drawing her gaze to her. Rias is a kind devil. House Gremory treat us all well. Issei isn't even a devil and he is treated as one of us. You won't be abandoned by her and we will help you. Her voice was the same calming, caring tone that she had used previously. Both Rias and Issei liked to see that side of her come out when talking to another. Sarah nodded to Aquino and smiled at her before turning back to Rias. Okay. I will be yours. But do I have to kiss you? She said simply and somewhat innocently. Rias smiled and chuckled softly at her response. No, not at all. I would never force my friends to do that. I simply love these two and we three are committed to each other. she replied before withdrawing her evil piece set from within her pocket. Opening it, Issei and Aquino peered inside to see what contents lay within. 8 pawns, 1 knight, 1 rook and 1 bishop were the pieces that remained. Rias considered Sarah before speaking to her again. "What position did you hold in your previous peerage?" she asked simply. "Pawn." A simple reply. "Hold your right arm out," Rias stated plainly. Sarah held her arm out and quick as a flash Rias cut the skin of her forearm slightly with a small knife tucked into the side of her pieces case. If Sarah registered pain at the cut, she hid it very well by not even flinching in the slightest. Rias then lifted a pawn piece toward the exposed wound. When less than a foot away, the piece left her hand and traveled into Sarah's flesh as of its own volition. In response, 3 more pawn pieces floated up and entered as well, with a dark swirling energy present around them all. Once the 4th piece had entered, Sarah's eyes rolled up into her head and she collapsed forward. Rias caught her as she began to fall. Aquino then took her unconscious body from her. With Aquino carrying Sarah's petite frame in her arms, Rias closed the evil piece box and tucked it away. Already the wound on Sarah's arm was knitting itself back together. "That about wraps things up for tonight, I suppose. She doesn't have anywhere to stay, so we might as well take her to the mansion," Rias stated in a calm, matter-of-fact voice. "Why doesn't she stay with us instead of having the hassle of a room in hell?" Aquino asked simply. Rias looked to Issei, who shrugged. "I don't mind. It's not like she could cause any harm, and it would be easier. It will probably help with assimilating her into the peerage as well," he said nonchalantly. "All right. Agreed," Rias replied as she summoned the Gremry symbol around the trio and they left the school for the last time. *19 Hyoto Lane, Kuo Town *. Friday, Aquino stayed home with Sarah. The young devil had taken to Aquino far more than Rias and Issei. That's not to say that she was rude or disruptive to the pair. Just simply distant and less sociable. With Aquino, however, the girl came out of her shell, and quickly it was noticed that she was happy to be the older girl's shadow. That made for a simple decision, with Rias realizing that it would be more efficient for Aquino to take the girl through the basics of House Gremry and help her rein back in her devil powers. Once the powers were under control, then devil nature would normalize as well. To that point, Issei and Rias had attended school without their girlfriend on Friday. Returning home, the pair found dinner already made and the 2 girls chatting happily in the living room while playing Super Smash Bros. On Issei's Nintendo Wii. Dinner was a simple affair, conversation flowing with Sarah. The girl was being a touch more receptive to speaking with Issei and Rias instead of just Aquino. However, she soon lost her appetite for conversation and food after watching Issei eat for a few minutes. That quick foray into the eating habits of Saiyans soon turned into a more in-depth explanation of Issei's non-devil origins. Sarah found her eyes go wide when Issei swished his tail from side to side, which he had kept comfortably wrapped around his waist until then. After seeing his tail swish around, the girl wondered how she hadn't previously noticed his appendage. While it did fit in as a belt on any form of brief inspection, it proved to be far a bit too thick and not quite positioned as a normal belt would. The shocks kept coming for the young girl, though, when she saw that a bright blue-white orb of energy around the size of a baseball was rolling along his knuckles on the back of his hand. Back and forth it rolled as Issei rolled his knuckles up and down. Sarah had never encountered any energy like this before, but even with the limited exposure to different types of magic she had from her previous master, she could tell that this small ball was far more potent and powerful than anything she had encountered before. "This," Issei began in a completely offhand manner, "is perfect pure ki. It's a form of energy that I am able to utilize directly from my own ki, or life force." "That's incredible," Sarah almost whispered as she simply watched the perfect orb. Aquino and Rias also watched the ball of pure power in their boyfriend's hand. No matter how many times they sought his power, it still amazed them. How much power he could wield and so quickly accumulate simply astonished them. "I can sort of feel it. Is that as powerful as it becomes?" Sarah asked innocently. Issei let out a short chuckle before dismissing the energy. Nope. Not at all. That was but a dewdrop in the ocean. He smirked slightly while being quite proud of his clever pun. Both Aquino and Rias rolled their eyes, being far less impressed than he was. Oh. Sarah stated before going very silent. She realized instantly that she never stood even a remote chance in her fight with Aquino and Issei. If Issei had fought her, she would have died before even knowing what had occurred. Previously, Sarah had been thoroughly annoyed by how much Issei had dismissed her ability to fight when they met. Still, she was annoyed, but now relief crept in there as well as she realized just how outclassed she was. The remainder of the night went how nights in the Hayadu residence usually went. Sarah had taken up residence as it were in Issei's old bedroom. Issei was happy to give her the bed as it was no longer used, yet he did feel slightly strange about someone he had just met, who also wanted to kill him initially, now living in the room that had been his personal sanctuary growing up. Saturday morning, the remaining members of Rias Peerage arrived for breakfast as had become their tradition before leaving to conduct training at the clubroom. Although usually unused on Sundays by the group, the academy was conducting an external sports carnival that had the sports clubs absent. The remaining school clubs would be located solely in the main building, allowing the occult research club to attend the school without fear of being observed, especially as their training was now solely inside the gravity chambers instead of outside as it previously had been. Kaneko, Kiba and Asia all greeted Sarah happily upon meeting her, with the young nun embracing the newest member in a warm hug, much to Sarah's discomfort. The awkward response of the newest pawn as the older blonde girl embraced her enthusiastically drew soft laughter from the remainder of the peerage. It became evident soon enough that Sarah had developed a friendly bond with Kaneko. The young girl felt more comfortable around the quiet and diminutive Kaneko, who she found to be quiet, easy relate to. The feelings were mutual, and Kaneko appreciated having someone in the peerage who was similar in nature to herself. After their usual breakfast of enough food to feed a small village which was almost entirely ate by only one member of the group, they all made their way to Kuo Academy and their clubhouse. Upon arriving, the group entered the clubhouse and set all their belongings aside. They then all filed into the gravity chamber. The operation and capabilities of the room was explained to Sarah as best it could be. The girl was simply blown away by the idea of training under enhanced gravity. Rias and Aquino explained that they started with a minor increase in the gravity and had been slowly increasing it as they progressed through their training. The enhanced gravity improved every form of training, not just the physical body. When Kiba and Kaneko explained that they trained in 29 times the gravity of Earth, the young girl was astounded and her admiration of Kaneko went up dramatically. She noticed the almost silent smirk on Issei's face and shot him a sideways glance before addressing her new friend. "Do I even want to know what his gravity is?" she asked with a deadpan expression. "No, you really don't," Kaneko replied, feeling her twinges of rivalry with Issei flaring at just how much more powerful the scion had become. The answer had the opposite effect on Sarah, though, making the young girl become instantly curious. "Okay, now I need to know. 40 times? 50 times? She had already come to realize that even though Rias and Aquino were the king and queen of the peerage, Issei was by far the most powerful member. Although not even technically a member. Issei smiled at the girl in a purely scion manner while scratching the back of his head as he replied. "I just hit 100. He said bluntly while feeling pride at his achievement swell in his chest. 100 times the gravitational force of Earth was a good achievement and milestone, but Issei knew it was simply a stepping stone along the long path of what he could achieve. "Damn!" was the only thing that Sarah could manage to say. He was just so powerful. The whole peerage laughed at her response before breaking up into groups to train. Issei moved to his usual green and silver room to push himself to his absolute limits. True to his words, the moment he entered, he set the gravity to 100 times that of the Earth and began torturing his body through his brutal regime. Sarah stood in the doorway, briefly having to see the claim for her own eyes before being able to truly believe it. Kiba took the blue room for himself with the gravity set to 29 times. He began a regime very similar to Issei's, with the only differences being the focus on swordsmanship rather than ki combat. Rias and Asia chose to utilize the yellow room once Sarah vacated back to the red room. They set the gravity to 15 times that of Earth.
Their morning training session began with physical conditioning and light sparring before moving to magical practice. With her training by Kiba, Kaneko and Issei, Asia was able to hold her own against the Princess of Destruction for a time until her weaker stamina left her tired and clumsy. Rias was not one to revel in victory against her subordinates and simply praised Asia on her improvement. After that, the two practiced their spells. Magic was an area in which Asia was far more talented. During this time, Akino, Kaneko and Sarah remained in the red entry room. Kaneko began by testing the girl on her physical combat abilities. Sarah released her claws and engaged Kaneko in mock combat. It became evident very quickly that Sarah had received no specific training of any sort in combat and that she had been relying purely on her magic and enhanced devil strength to overwhelm opponents. Kaneko decided that as Sarah's claws were similar in nature to her Nikomata claws, that the younger girl would become her prodigy and she would endeavor to teach her everything she possibly could of her styles. With her smaller size, Sarah suited Kaneko's feline combat style well and enjoyed what the white-haired girl could teach her before Akino swapped in. With Akino, Sarah practiced her magic. Akino was incredibly patient and willing to spend a long time on explaining each key point of improvement that Sarah could apply to improve her use of the shoki she drew upon. As with her physical skills, her previous master had barely taught her anything in regards to her magical abilities. Just simply enough to use a spell without killing herself, but nothing of the talents required to perfect, hone and improve her spells. Akino found Sarah an absolute delight to teach as the younger girl hung on her every word and was determined to master everything that the older girl could explain to her. As lunchtime approached, the group all finished their training for the morning and emigrated to the main building, where they found a wide spread of food awaiting them. Issei kept his saiyan urges in check long enough for everyone else to have seated themselves and plated up a portion of food before digging in himself. While he seemingly became a food vacuum, the rest of the peerage chatted and ate at a far more human pace. Sarah found herself smiling ever so slightly as she listened to the happy chatting and playful banter of the group. They were a massive contradiction to the previous peerage she had been a part of. This felt more like a family than a collection of individuals. With their meal complete and dishes magically removed, the group relaxed, allowing their bodies to digest before the afternoon's training. Issei was the first to climb to his feet. He couldn't in good saiyan conscience allow himself to waste time that could be spent training. He was about to leave the room when a familiar flash of red energy filled the room. Even before turning around, Issei knew who it was by tracing the energy of the individual with his key sense. Issei was happy to know that his technique was correct when he turned to see Graphia standing in the room. Before anyone could say anything, the Queen of Hell spoke in a manner that stated plainly that this was all business. Sirzex and I have something important to discuss with you all about. Pack your belongings, we are expected in hell.